How many of you have the little brochure here, this little introduction in here? Because in the interest of time, it's got a very good kind of introduction and background, so I'm just going to basically dispense with that and just move straight in to what we should be playing here. I want to explain to an auto show crowd cities. First and foremost, a city is about people, okay? It's about people, it's about the places, it's the places we live, we work, we party, we just hang out, we chill, and we do all of those things. So got to remember that when we're talking about our concept of the city, it's not the city and its roads, it's not the city and its traffic, it's not all of these things, it's the city and the people. And basically, what we're going to be talking about today is from the perspective of the quality of life of the people. Now you're wondering about, we're talking about the city of 2050, and there's something going on up here behind me. Look at that. We'll have a quiz about this later. So, in 2050, 2/3 of the people on this planet, it is estimated, will be living in a city. What does that mean? It means density. We're going to be denser cities, which is positive. It's basically going to make it ecologically, environmentally, energy more efficient. It'll make our transportation, give it that density, it'll make it work better. But also it's probably going to introduce sprawl. And the data says that it could go either way, or it could be a combination of both. Now sprawl is going to increase our carbon footprint. It's detrimental. And so these are the items which this afternoon I want to have our panelists here, Jeff Tumlin of Nelson Nygaard, Mark Bünger, to talk about different aspects of that. So I'm going to be your moderator for this afternoon. My name is Gerry Tierney. I'm with Perkins+Will. We're a large international architecture urban design firm. And we've been studying this since back in the days of about 2010, when to talk about autonomous vehicles put you right up there with being at a Star Trek convention. You'd start talking to people and a little smile would come on their face and they back away from you, going, yeah, sure, yeah. Okay, that's kind of where we're at. So, moving along, we're at an automobile show here. And what's the most important thing about mobility? The wheel? Wrong. I'll put it to you that the most important thing is this little device in our hand. And right now, I actually have Lyft application open, so I hope I don't have a Lyft driver waiting outside here for me. But in doing this, what this has meant is that this has allowed us to get into a sharing environment. And this is something we want to talk about today, and I think it's critical as we move forward into the city of the future, that we're looking at a sharing environment, not an ownership environment. In other words, we're going to be moving away from the notion, I think, of going down to the auto dealer and buying a car. If anything, you're going to be going down to General Motors or Ford or Chrysler or whomsoever and buying a subscription to one of those firms. You think that's far-fetched? San Francisco, 2 blocks from our office, high-rise goes up. Across the way, big billboard for Audi. If you live in this high-rise, you get a subscription to Audi. I want to go on a hot date, I get an Audi sports car. I want to go up to Lake Tahoe, I get myself an SUV. So, it's happening, folks. We are moving away from I go down to the dealer and purchase my car model, and we're going into a subscription model. Second thing I want to talk about is space. Currently in the streets, if we look out here on Pico or Figueroa, at least 80% of our public space is taken up and given to vehicles. Vehicles that aren't even using that 80% in a particularly efficient way. But if we go into an autonomous environment, we can probably increase the efficiency of that environment by at least 100%, 200%. I've heard even numbers like 300%. So I'll go the most conservative route and say we'll double the efficiency. So our 80-foot curb to curb goes down to a 40-foot curb to curb. Imagine what Pico out there would go from. Instead of 6 lanes right now, it will go down to 3 lanes. Figueroa, the same thing. And so you take that space and you give that over to the public realm. You make your sidewalks wider. You allow for bike lanes. It just simply, you start creating a more habitable, humane city street environment. Instead of having traffic sewers, as we call them, which is really what Pico is going right here between Figueroa and the next block over. That really is a traffic sewer. It just runs vehicles down there as fast as it possibly can. Really, the pedestrian and the cyclist, God forbid, are just pushed to the edges. And also, remember the film going down Market Street? That shows you how people interacted with the public realm before the advent of the private automobile. Since the time of Mesopotamia, when we've had cities, this is the way that people walked around a city. I walked down a street. I see a friend across the other side of the street. I simply walked across the street, said hi. I saw something else across the street. I walked this way. Now we're all trained to walk like little rats along the baseboard down to the intersection, push the little sign and wait for the little sign to come on. And if you're on a big wide boulevard, sometimes you can't even make it across that boulevard on one light crossing. You're stranded there in the traffic out in the middle. That's a city? Please, it's not. So in the world of an autonomous vehicle, this is the kind of environment we can have. The autonomous vehicle is mingling with the pedestrians. So I'm going to use the example of my hometown, San Francisco, here. If we start applying what we just talked about, putting the streets on a road diet, that's all the little streets have gone orange to blue, and so we put them on a road diet, and you see that green thing up there? That's Golden Gate Park. Some of you might be familiar with it, but there's an aerial photograph of Golden Gate Park, and we take that. If we put all of the streets in San Francisco on the road diet, you basically have the opportunity of recapturing 1 3/4 Golden Gate Parks to distribute throughout the public realm of somewhere like San Francisco. Imagine what an amazing gift that is and how humane that would make a city. So if we were to use the same metrics in somewhere like Los Angeles, let's say we took 1 3/4 Griffith Parks and we distributed that across downtown LA or out to the ocean like that, what sort of a city would we have? You would have a city where it would actually be pleasant to walk down a street. It would be pleasant and safe to ride your bicycle. You could skateboard. You could use other little devices we've seen out here on the other side of the tent. So this is kind of like the environment that I want to have Jeff and to Mark talk about. And we'll be having some questions, and I'm going to be having some questions as well from the audience. But I wanted to set up that first and foremost, we're looking at the city as a place for people, and it's the quality of life, and it has to be for everybody, not just simply the person who owns a private automobile, okay? So that is basically our metrics. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Jeff.
Thanks, Gerry. So my name is Jeff Tumlin. I'm with a transportation planning firm called Nygaard, and I am a transportation nerd. And I feel like a gleeful 12-year-old boy wandering around in the exhibit hall, seeing all these amazing transportation technologies out there. But I'm also a historian, or pretend to be one on TV at least. And I recognize that pretty much nothing out there in the exhibit halls is new. In fact, whoops, going backwards. In fact, even Elon Musk's very famous Hyperloop was first described in Popular Mechanics in 1867 and fully developed by the 1920s. And in fact, almost everything that is out there in the exhibit hall has already been seen before, specifically in the Futurama exhibits sponsored by General Motors at the 1933, 39, and 64 World's Fairs. Futurama was the most visited industrial exhibit in the history of the world. And in 1939, in the Great Depression, about 1/3 of the population of the United States saw that. And it has very much shaped our vision of the city of the future, including the vision that many of us still hold, which is from the 1962 Hanna-Barbera cartoon, The Jetsons, which also predicted many of the technologies on display, including the flying car, which was designed to solve our congestion problem. But of course, even on the Jetsons, they recognized the law of induced demand comes into play, and even flying cars don't solve our problems. Many of us, myself included, I used to work at Disneyland when I was in high school, are irritated by this gap between the promise of the 1950s and what we contend with every day in our commutes. It is extremely irritating. And we are about to repeat the problems of the 1950s by not understanding a couple of fundamental constants. One is We are not thinking through the unintended consequences of our actions, and 2, we're not asking the right questions about what technology can do. Fortunately, since the 50s, there's been a lot of advancement in understanding our physical and psychological needs, including the fundamental needs of the human body. We need 10,000 steps every day in order to function optimally. And WALL-E accurately predicts the public health outcome of autonomous vehicles if we do not take corrective action now and design our cities to take advantage of the efficiency of autonomous vehicles to become utterly delightful for walking and biking. Because we know the unintended negative consequences of unregulated autonomous vehicles. But even more interesting are the advances in neuroscience that quantify the habitat conditions that optimize human happiness, right? Who doesn't want to be happy? This is a neuropeptide called oxytocin, and it is the biological basis of social trust. It is also produced under very specific circumstances. It is produced when we gaze longingly into the eyes of someone we love. It is produced, obviously, in greatest proportion with breastfeeding and orgasm. But it is also produced, remarkably, when we exercise outdoors. Scientists do not understand why it is not produced on a treadmill in a gym, but when we exercise outdoors, and you've experienced this when you've had an argument with your spouse and have gone out for a walk or a run or a swim, and suddenly everything feels better again. That is not the world changing, that is your brain chemistry changing as a result of getting outside. We also know, and it is a clinical term now, road rage, and how being stuck in a car and being separated from the social signals that drive the functioning of our brain, how it instead triggers the fight or flight response and makes permanent changes to the brain that make us more angry, less trustful, less capable of thinking through the consequences of our actions. And indeed, not to get too much into national politics, but Nate Silver famously tweeted that people vote Republican where there are no sidewalks. So, how does this bring us back to autonomous vehicles? Well, there are tremendous upsides that we want to capture, right? About 30,000 Americans die every year as a result of human error because we're allowed to drive these 2,000-pound giant metal boxes hurtling at high speeds towards each other while texting. We also, as Gerry also alluded to, can dramatically rethink our cities. Autonomous vehicles pretty much eliminate urban parking demand, allowing us tremendous opportunities for transforming our cities. They introduce a specific amount of greater efficiency in our transportation network, allowing us potentially to reallocate roadway space for better and higher productive uses. They make connections that are currently impossible and provide connections to transit for people who don't live near transit. But one thing that they don't do is solve our congestion problem, and that is because of what we call the law of induced demand. None of us likes sitting in congestion in our cars. We complain, we demand that the roadway gets widened, we raise our tax dollars, and that results in the road getting widened and suddenly driving becoming a little faster. So, honey, now we can, go to that show that we wouldn't have gone to, or better yet, move to the bigger, cheaper house farther away because they just widened the highway. The problem with faster driving is it means more people drive longer distances, which brings us back to congestion, which makes us demand to widen the roadway, and so on, caught in the usual cycle of congestion that this region in particular faces. Well, guess what? Autonomous vehicles unleash an extraordinary amount of induced demand because they remove the last of the checks on induced demand, particularly the value of our time. When suddenly you can rent the office autonomous vehicle and work, or the hotel room autonomous vehicle and sleep, or the hot tub autonomous vehicle and do we don't even want to know what. The world changes. Why not live 3 hours away from where you work? Autonomous vehicles don't change the fundamental geometry of having giant metal boxes around us. Walking, biking, public transit are about 10 times more space efficient than driving. And whether you're driving alone in your car or riding in an Uber or Lyft or in an autonomous vehicle, you're still taking up a lot of space. So what do? Well, as Gerry said, the first and most important thing is to make sure that autonomous vehicles are largely shared rather than individually owned. But more importantly, autonomous vehicles create an interesting opportunity for cities that allow cities to realize their most valuable asset, which is public roadway space. In order not to have the dire unintended negative consequences of autonomous vehicles, cities are going to need to manage their roadway space. And what this means is pricing not the trip taken, but wasted space in the vehicle. We need to be charging for empty seats and empty cargo space in order to make sure that we get the highest public good out of autonomous vehicles. But more importantly, we need to remember to ask the correct questions. How does these new technologies improve public health, improve public happiness, and more importantly, create opportunities for the only experience that the human brain never tires of, which is beauty? Thank you.
Mark. Yeah. Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Bünger. I'm a VP of Research at a company called Lux Research. And it's my job to look at the intersection of technology and business, so kind of science to the store, lab to marketplace. And this area of autonomous vehicles is one that brings together a whole lot of technologies and economic considerations and the impact on social things as well. So, like everybody, I'll start with the Jetsons. Jetsons are just sort of the symbol of our utopia is the feedback loop. Utopia? Okay. And we keep referring back to these flying cars, and that's kind of a nice vision of the future. Then there's also the vision of Mad Max, the typical commute to the watering hole or the petrol station. And had I thought 1 second more, I actually would have taken a different dystopic vision for this example, Blade Runner. So how many of you saw Blade Runner? All right, where's Blade Runner set? Right here. What year? 2019. It's like really soon. Okay, so Blade Runner was from 1982, and it's written about 2019, which is almost exactly the same span as from now to 2050. It's a little bit less than 40 years. So as wrong as Blade Runner was about Los Angeles now, that's about as wrong as anything we're going to say today is going to be about the city of 2050. There is no way to predict the impact of technologies that far in advance. And we can say that because we have a history of people predicting technologies in the future. And generally, your time horizon is something like maybe 10 years, 5 years if it's something like mobile devices. We've only had those things for 8 years. So when we talk about the city of 2050 today, I'm actually talking more about the city of 2025 and some of the near-term impacts that I think that we're going to have from autonomous vehicles. So, as you've heard many times today, cities are a vast collection of technologies. A lot of things go into making cities work. So we heard earlier today from I believe the taxi commissioner here in Los Angeles, and he talked about their NORAD-like base in the, underground in the extinct volcano that is City Hall, and how that's sort of going to be the mind for the future autonomous vehicle system. So when we look at these technologies that we think of as smart city technologies, that's kind of the core circles here. It's things like city dashboards, big data, civic hackathons, basically what we think of as information technology applied to cities. And cities and a lot of companies spend a lot of time thinking about how those things will interact. But most of the technologies that will have the biggest impact on cities and how they're structured are actually outside of that altogether. So they're things like connected aging. Not only are we going to have more people in cities, but those people are going to be older. That might affect how they want to walk to the store, or if they get a ride in an autonomous vehicle. We might have urban agriculture. We might have other ways of growing food as opposed to shipping it in from far away. But the technologies I pointed out here, electric and autonomous vehicles, transport and logistics are going to be the biggest impact on this entire city picture. And again, looking back at history, we can see how that's happened in the past. So you saw the picture earlier from, I won't spoil where it was from, but we saw a picture earlier of the traffic from a long, long time ago. That traffic is kind of the same today. But manufacturing has totally left cities. We just had a whole election that was a referendum on why manufacturing has left cities. What was the answer? NAFTA or shipping our jobs overseas or things like that. Why did that happen? That happened because of shipping containers. The containerization, those standard containers that go from ship by the thousands to trains by the hundreds and to trucks by the ones, that is what made global trade what it is today. And autonomous vehicles will have a similar impact on transportation and logistics by making it frictionless. So some of the impacts, like I say, we can start to foresee even now. These future modes of delivery, getting things around cities, if people and packages can move around frictionlessly, then it starts to look a little bit more like the way we watch movies today, or the way we read the newspaper, or the way we consume music. We used to go and buy these things. They were physical products in the store. You had to go to the record store, buy a record, take it home, put it on some special equipment that was designed to sort of unpack the record and use it for you so you could hear the music on it. There are a lot of things that we think of as physical products today that will become information products in that same way. So some of the early signs that we see of this happening, this frictionless logistics with autonomy, are the integration of vans and drones. So delivery vans making the sort of last mile from the big truck to the local store, or even to your house with your package. There are a couple companies I'll show you in just a second that are actually working on integrating those things with cars. Uber and Amazon are both making huge efforts in the area of logistics, and not just taxi-like. Uber is in cargo, Uber is in meal delivery, Uber is in connecting with airlines, Uber is in public transportation, that last mile. We saw the picture with Lyft. Amazon, as you know, is all over the place. They're right out here on the Oli van and on the Hyundai vehicle. So Uber's getting very much into being a logistics play. They've bought an airport in Germany. They're really thinking big about this. And then what's just starting to tick is we're seeing a lot of flying car projects. You just heard from Dezo Molnar, who's got one of these prototypes, which is really cool. But Uber and Airbus are also making big investments in that space. So I mentioned UAVs and platforms. UAVs and vehicle platforms as an accessory to vehicles. So these are Ford and Daimler that are both looking at their trucks, their utilitarian vehicles, and integrating them with autonomous drones. So rather than the truck coming, stopping outside your house, the guy getting out of the truck, walking up to your door, setting the package on, going back in, now he's just lost a few minutes, right? Those trucks could just drive slowly down and around the streets with drones making those last few meters delivery, and it would never have to stop. So the optimization of that has a lot to gain. Another area, again, of these drone delivery is integrating it with demand. So this is what Amazon's doing. They're not just looking at how to get the package to your house with a drone. They're also looking at how do we know when you want something before you actually want it. They have these devices that you've seen that, again, are integrating with the Hyundai as an example outside, where you say, I'd like a pizza, or I'd like to order an Uber, and Amazon then sends that thing to you. But they have something called anticipatory logistics. They know from your past purchasing history what you're likely to purchase next. And they actually forward ship that to you so they can deliver it to you in an hour and not in a day. So imagine that same thing that I mentioned about your record. Now if they are streaming records to you, why couldn't they stream food? If they know what you like to eat, they know when you like to eat it, they know how many people are in your house, things like that, it's not a problem for them to do the same thing with food or other types of consumer products. Basically go to a subscription model for those things. So I'm just about out of time, so if you have questions about that, we can talk about that with the follow-ups. I did want to just mention, though, the flying taxi concepts. Now, these are just concepts at this point, but both Airbus, that's the company that makes about half of the commercial aircraft in the world, and Uber are looking at electric autonomous flight. So basically, you get in a car, it zips up into the sky, flies across the city, and sets you down for roughly the same cost as you pay today, but in a fraction of the time that would take. So these are just concepts today, but I think they're really promising, and in the 2025 timeframe, I'm sure several of us will have been riding in these, and maybe a lot of us. So with that, thank you very much.
Okay. We've got microphones left and right over here for anybody who wants to ask us some questions. We've just got about 6 minutes left here. I'm going to throw out a question to Jeff here. We can see that we can either have the Wall-E world or we can have this healthful world you were describing. What is the fork in the road? What would be the key thing there that would make us go one direction or the other?
So frankly, I think we need to start right now with rethinking the way that we're regulating transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft in predicting this future that they already see and managing it for the highest public good. The other thing is changing all the rules and regulations in cities that are still rooted in this 1950s version of the world. Why are cities still forcing developers to build more parking than the market would warrant when we know that parking doesn't have a future as a land use?
There we go. And Mark, I want to kind of like look at sort of like the messiness. We're starting to predict the future in here, and we're looking out over 25 years. We know in the realm of the digital world, 25 years, for God's sakes. I mean, you know, empires will have risen and fallen by then. Can you make any predictions about that? I mean, I hope there's nobody in the room here from Toyota or General Motors, but could they go the way of the AOLs and the CompuServes and things like that? What do they need to be looking out for?
Yeah, it's hard for us to think of car companies as, again, kind of just disappearing all of a sudden, although they do that every so often when there's a recession, but because of technology, because they've really resisted that for a long time. But the reason that car makers got religion about autonomous vehicles about 3 years ago was because Google was already doing it. And the specific example from history that they keyed into was when Google launched Android, the operating system for most of the mobile phones in the world, at 80% of the mobile phones in the world. Nokia was the #1 phone maker in the world. Within a few years, Nokia is now well, it is gone. BlackBerry too, gone. These were companies that were iconic of that time. It's not that Google started making phones. They allowed Samsung to become the #1 phone maker in the world. And so the car makers are afraid that Chinese car makers or for example, Korean car makers like Hyundai could take that same role. And that's in fact exactly what's happening. Hyundai is partnering with Google to basically look at autonomous vehicles.
Okay. And Jeff, I'm going to throw one back to you. When we start talking about the public right-of-way, we've got Pico out here, we have Figueroa. Really, talk to us about the city kind of managing that asset. I mean, we don't think of this as being an asset that the city needs to manage. We think of it only in terms of traffic. Is there another way we need to be managing that?
So the public streets are about between 1/4 and 1/3 of most cities' area. And all of that is in public ownership. This is the most extraordinary public asset in the history of public assets. It's incredibly valuable. So it needs to be seen as a land asset and not just this sort of thing set aside for cars. And we need to start making changes now to anticipate technology change. So parking is declining in its value, but curbside is increasing dramatically. We have a client, I'm not even sure, we can't really talk about our client.
Don't talk about client.
Major event center that is noticing that its parking demand is dropping dramatically because folks have realized that it's always cheaper to take Uber or Lyft to this major facility than it is to drive and park. And they were terrified about their loss of parking revenue until they realized that their beer revenue was rising at the same time their parking revenue was dropping. And that what they needed to do is to change their business model to adapt and focus on curb management rather than holding on to this parking supply.
And finally, Mark, I've got a question for you. We're talking about little drones, and you had flying Ubers and things like that. Have we simply moved the problem from the city street and stuck it 100 feet, 200 feet in the air? Am I going to be like, you know, on the 19th story of my high-rise open up, and I'm going like, oh God, here goes somebody cruising by my window? Have we just simply moved the problem?
It's funny. It's actually much easier to have autonomous flying vehicles because there's nothing to run into. And so this idea that we're going to be in like the Jetsons cartoon that you showed is ridiculous. If you just sort of take, you know, the traffic jams that you sit in, and then you make them 20 stories tall. I mean, you have hundreds of feet to go up in the air. You might not even see another vehicle. So I don't think that traffic jams in the sky there's really any risk at all of that happening.
Okay. We have 2 minutes left. I want some kind of concluding thoughts in here. Our brave new world of 2050.
There's a question on there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. There's a hand being waving. So you've got a minute and 45 seconds.
Hi, Stacy Randacker Bartlett, FutureCar.com. Cities of the future. which cities are poised to actually make this happen? So much needs to move so that autonomous vehicles can have their reign. Are there cities that are actually going to be able to get all the forces of their people and labor and government and the constituents to come to the table and make this realized?
Jeff's going to answer. My vote is Helsinki. Anyway.
So the cities that are going to do best are the ones that are going to emphasize quality, because quality always sells. And frankly, I think that the cities that are most likely to make the transition most effectively, ironically, are going to be fiscal conservative Republican-run cities, because they're going to be the only ones that are going to be able to take on the labor problem that is necessary to address to allow public transit to transition to autonomous vehicles, right? That's the only way that transit is going to survive, and cities will continue to be dependent upon high-capacity, publicly managed transit.
Yeah, and actually, I would, following up on that, I'd have people look at Kansas City and what Bridge is doing in conjunction with Kansas City Transit, where basically they're working cooperatively, where the Kansas City Transit drivers are driving essentially like Bridge vehicles. Any other one last? We've got 20 seconds. We've got less than that, like that. Mark, any concluding thoughts here?
Well, since it's an election year, at least until recently, the contrarian view would be that the denser cities are where this type of transportation makes more sense. It's where the utilization is higher because you have more people moving in a smaller geographical space. So those cities, denser cities, in the U.S. anyway, almost all lean Democratic. I don't think, though, there's an actual political angle to this. I think it has a lot more to do with the technology friendliness of the cities and the willingness to experiment with new things. And we see, I can name specific cities where they have a chief innovation officer. They have we were talking earlier about Columbus, just won the Smart City Challenge. So there's cities out there where it's really more a question of individual leadership than about political leanings, and I think that's a great place for us to end.
Okay, as you can see, we are barely scratching the surface of this topic. We could go on for another hour or two, literally. A big round of applause, please, for the panel, for Jeff and for Mark.